The cold, gritty texture of the sidewalk was the last thing I expected to feel against my face on a Tuesday afternoon. One moment I was reaching out to catch a woman who had collapsed in the middle of the street, and the next I was being slammed into the pavement with a knee pressed firmly into the small of my back. "Don't move, you animal," a voice spat above me. A voice I recognized not from the local precinct's roster, but from my own wedding photos, belonging to the man who was supposed to be my brother-in-law. As the metal cuffs clicked shut with a finality that echoed through the silent street, I looked up through the blur of rain and saw my wife, Sarah, standing only 5 feet away. Her arms were folded, her expression as blank as a fresh sheet of paper, while her mother, Evelyn, leaned in to whisper something in her ear that made them both share a small, triumphant smile. That moment of impact, the sudden transition from Good Samaritan to criminal, was a jagged line cutting my life in two. I was a man who had spent 10 years building a reputation, a career, and a family, only to realize that the people I shared my bed and my table with were merely waiting for the right moment to bury me. Before the world turned upside down, my life was a symphony of ordered, beautiful things. I am an architect, a man who finds peace in blueprints and the structural integrity of steel and stone. Our home, a meticulously restored 1920s brownstone on the edge of the historic district, was my masterpiece. I spent 3 years stripping back layers of cheap wallpaper and rotted wood to reveal the mahogany bones underneath. Sarah used to sit on the floor of the unfinished living room, sipping wine and watching me work, telling me that I was building our forever. The smell of cedar shavings and expensive floor wax was the scent of my happiness. Every morning began the same way. The sun would slant through the floor-to-ceiling windows of our kitchen, hitting the marble countertops and the copper pots Sarah insisted on hanging, even though I was the one who did most of the cooking. I'd grind the coffee beans, a rich, dark roast that filled the house with an earthy aroma, and listen to the soft thud of Sarah's footsteps as she came downstairs. She was a woman of soft edges and quiet grace, or so I believed. She worked in consulting, a vague term that allowed her to spend most of her days at galleries or lunching with her mother, but she always came home with stories of her busy day, and I, blinded by a decade of devotion, never thought to look closer. Then there was Evelyn. My mother-in-law was a woman who smelled of Chanel No. 5 and old, rotting resentment. She was a fixture in our lives, a sharp-tongued matriarch who never quite forgave her daughter for marrying a man whose pedigree didn't include a country club membership or a trust fund. Evelyn had a way of looking at me as if I were a particularly persistent stain on an otherwise white carpet. She lived in a sprawling estate 3 towns over, but she was in our house at least 4 times a week, rearranging the pillows on the sofa and making snide remarks about the neighborhood's changing demographics. "It's just her way, Marcus," Sarah would say, pressing a kiss to my cheek whenever I complained about a particularly pointed comment. "She's from a different generation. She doesn't mean anything by it. She's just protective of me." I wanted to believe her. I needed to believe her because Sarah was the anchor of my world. I had grown up with very little, the son of a single mother who worked 3 jobs to put me through school, and Sarah represented everything I had fought to achieve: stability, beauty, and a sense of belonging. I poured everything into her and our home. 2 years ago, when Sarah mentioned she wanted to start her own boutique firm, I didn't hesitate. I used my savings to lease her an office and put the deed of our brownstone into a joint trust, thinking it was the ultimate gesture of partnership. I remember the weight of the pen in my hand as I signed those documents, the feeling of pride that I could provide such security for my wife. I didn't see the way her hand trembled, not with nerves, but with anticipation. The cracks were there, of course, hidden in the shadows of our perfect life. Small things. Sarah started changing her phone passcode every week. Evelyn began asking very specific questions about the equity in the house and the status of my latest architectural contract with the city. And then there was Sarah's brother, Thomas. He was a police officer with a record of excessive force complaints that the family always managed to hush up.
Thomas had never spoken more than 10 words to me in 5 years, and every one of them had been dripping with a quiet, simmering vitriol. He viewed his sister as a prize that I had somehow stolen, a sentiment Evelyn clearly encouraged.
A week before the incident, I found Sarah and her mother in the study, huddled over a stack of papers. The room was dim, lit only by the desk lamp, and the air felt heavy, as if the oxygen had been sucked out of it. When I walked in, Sarah slammed the folder shut and slid it under a magazine, her face flushing a deep, guilty crimson. "Just planning some surprises for your birthday, honey," she had said, her voice a pitch too high. "It's 3 months away," I replied, a small note of unease tightening in my chest. Evelyn had just looked at me with those cold, pale eyes and smiled. "Good things take time to prepare, Marcus. You, of all people, should know that a solid foundation is everything." I laughed it off, chalking it up to my own stress from work. I was finalizing the plans for a new community center, a project that was set to be the crowning achievement of my career. I was exhausted, drained by 18-hour days, and I desperately wanted to believe that my home was my sanctuary. I didn't realize that the foundation Evelyn was talking about wasn't for a building, but for a trap. One designed to strip me of my dignity, my property, and my freedom in one fell swoop. The day of the arrest started out so normally it was painful to look back on. I had cooked breakfast, omelets with chives from our garden. Sarah had been uncharacteristically affectionate, lingering over her coffee and asking me if I'd be walking through the park on my way to the site meeting. She knew my route. She knew exactly when I'd be passing the corner of 4th and Oak. "I might see you there," she'd said, smoothing my collar. "I'm meeting Mom for a late lunch nearby." As I stepped out of the house that afternoon, the air was thick with the scent of coming rain. I felt good. I felt successful. I was a man in his prime, living the life he had designed for himself. I saw the woman first, a stranger in a tan trench coat. She was walking ahead of me, swaying slightly. As I drew closer, she let out a soft groan and crumpled to the sidewalk. My instincts took over. I dropped my briefcase and knelt beside her, reaching out to support her head, asking if she could hear me. And that was when the siren chirped. That was when the world stopped being mine. The weight of the handcuffs wasn't just physical. It was the weight of a decade of lies finally pressing down on my wrists. As Thomas shoved my head down to get me into the back of the patrol car, the scent of stale upholstery and cheap air freshener filled my nostrils, mixing with the metallic tang of blood from where my lip had hit the pavement. I looked through the smeared glass of the cruiser window. The fainting woman was already on her feet, brushing the dust off her tan trench coat. She wasn't looking for a doctor. She was taking a thick, white envelope from Evelyn's gloved hand. They didn't even try to hide it. They were standing there in the rain, 3 generations of a family I thought I belonged to, watching me be hauled away like trash. My mind raced back, frantically trying to piece together the breadcrumbs I had been too blind to see. The warning signs had been there, whispering in the corners of our home, but I had mistaken them for the mundane friction of marriage. 3 weeks ago, I had received a call from our private banker, Mr. Henderson. His voice had been hesitant, layered with a professional pity that should have chilled me. "Mr. Sterling, I'm calling about the wire transfer to the offshore holding company. We just wanted to verify the signature on the authorization for the final 50,000. I remember standing in my office, looking out at the skyline I had helped shape, and laughing. 50,000? Mr. Henderson, there must be a mistake. I haven't authorized any transfers. My wife handles the household accounts. Maybe she moved some funds for the boutique?" "It's signed by both of you, Marcus," Henderson had said, his voice dropping an octave. "And the holding company is registered under an E. Vance. That would be your mother-in-law, correct?" When I confronted Sarah that evening, she had been a masterpiece of redirection. She didn't get angry. She didn't deny it. Instead, she burst into tears, her small frame shaking as she leaned against the marble island I had installed for her. "I was so ashamed to tell you," she sobbed, her face buried in her hands. "Mom's estate is in trouble, Marcus. Some bad investments. I thought if I could just bridge the gap for a month, you'd never have to worry about it. I was going to put it back before the quarter ended. Please don't be mad. I did it for us, so she wouldn't have to move in with us. I had held her. I had actually apologized for making her feel like she had to hide it. I told her we were a team. I was a fool who thought love was a shield, when in reality it was just a blindfold. Then there were the legal consultations. Sarah began spending every Thursday evening at her mother's house. Just helping Mom with the paperwork for the estate sale, she'd claim. I noticed she started carrying a slim, locked leather briefcase, something she'd never used before. Once, I found her in the library, the floor covered in blueprints of our brownstone, and several documents with gold seals. "Why do you have the original deeds out, Sarah?" I had asked, pouring myself a glass of water. She didn't jump. She just looked up, her eyes cold for a split second, before the mask of the doting wife slid back into place. "Oh, Mom's lawyer thinks there might be an encroachment issue with the neighbor's fence. He wanted to verify the property lines. You know how litigious people are in this zip code." "The fence hasn't moved in 100 years, I remarked. "Better safe than sorry, darling," she'd replied, her voice as smooth as silk and just as thin. Sitting in the back of that police car, the safety she'd promised felt like a noose. I watched Thomas lean against the driver's side door, laughing with Sarah through the open window. My heart was hammering against my ribs, a frantic, trapped bird. My breath came in ragged gasps, fogging the window. I felt a sudden, violent surge of nausea as the realization began to take a physical shape. This wasn't a misunderstanding. This was a liquidation. Thomas finally climbed into the driver's seat. He didn't start the engine. He just sat there, looking at me through the rearview mirror, a predatory glint in his eyes. He tossed a heavy manila folder onto the passenger seat, and it slid open. My eyes locked onto the document on top. It was a petition for emergency injunction and transfer of assets. My name was at the top, but beneath it, in the space for the petitioner, was Sarah's name. And right under that, a checked box next to the words, "Subject deemed a physical threat to spouse and family." "You like the paperwork, Marcus?" Thomas asked, his voice a low, guttural rasp. "My sister's been working on that for months. You see, a man with your temperament, a man who assaults a defenseless woman in broad daylight? Well, a judge is going to find it very easy to sign over every last brick of that house to the poor, terrified wife." "I didn't touch her, Thomas," I whispered, my voice cracking. "You saw it. She fell. I helped her." Thomas turned around in his seat, his face inches from the wire mesh. "What I saw was a thug attacking a citizen, and that's what my report is going to say. That's what the witness, who, by the way, is a very respected friend of my mother's, is going to testify to. By the time you get out of central booking, the locks on the brownstone will be changed, your accounts will be closed, and your reputation will be a smoking crater." He tapped the folder. "Sarah's already signed the papers to sell the house to a developer Mom knows. They're turning it into condos. You're not just losing your wife, Marcus. You're being erased." The world seemed to tilt. The oxygen in the car turned to lead. My hands, still cuffed behind me, began to shake so violently that the metal rattled against the plastic seat. It wasn't just fear. It was the sheer, agonizing cold of a betrayal so absolute it felt like my internal organs were freezing. My own wife had used my compassion as the trigger for a trap. She had known I would stop for that woman. She had timed it. She had choreographed my ruin with the precision of an architect. "Why?" I managed to choke out. 10 years, why would she do this? Thomas chuckled, a dry, hollow sound. "Because you were never one of us, Marcus. You were a project, a way for her to annoy Mom for a decade. But projects end. And Mom's got a much better investment lined up for Sarah now. Someone with a name that actually means something." He turned the key in the ignition. The engine roared to life, a mechanical growl that signaled the end of my life as I knew it. As the car pulled away from the curb, I saw Sarah and Evelyn walking toward our front door.
The door I had spent months stripping and staining by hand. They didn't look back. They would cross inside and close the door, shutting me out of the world I had built, leaving me in the dark, heading toward a cell they had spent years building for me. The interrogation room was a concrete box that smelled of stale sweat and bleach. For 6 hours I sat in the dark, my hands still cuffed to a metal bar on the table, while Thomas periodically entered to throw photos of the victim in front of me. She had a bruise on her cheek that wasn't there when I touched her. "She's pressing charges, Marcus," Thomas whispered, leaning over the table, his breath smelling of peppermint and malice. "Aggravated assault, hate crime enhancement. You're not going home. But Sarah, she's a saint. She told me she doesn't want to see you rot if there's a way out. Sign this, and I'll lose the body cam footage that proves you hit her. The charges disappear. You just walk away." He slid a document across the table.
It wasn't a confession. It was a full, irrevocable transfer of my architectural firm's intellectual property and a quitclaim deed for my share of the brownstone. "Where is she?" I asked, my voice a dry rattle. I want to hear it from her. The door opened and Sarah walked in. She looked devastatingly beautiful, dressed in a soft cream sweater I'd bought her for our anniversary. She wouldn't look at my face. Her eyes were fixed on a spot somewhere near my shoulder. Behind her, Evelyn hovered like a shadow, her hands resting on Sarah's shoulders. "Sarah, look at me," I pleaded. The physical pain of the cuffs was nothing compared to the hollowness in my chest. "Tell me you didn't do this. Tell me you didn't hire that woman to fall." Sarah's lip trembled, a flicker of the woman I thought I knew, but then Evelyn squeezed her shoulders. "Tell him, Sarah," the older woman hissed. "Tell him the truth about how you felt all these years. The fear, the suffocating weight of his intensity." Sarah finally met my eyes, but there was nothing there. No love, no hatred, just a terrifying, glassy void. "You were always too much, Marcus," she said, her voice a rehearsed monotone. "The house, the career, the way you looked at me like I was a project you'd finished. I didn't want a masterpiece. I wanted a life that belonged to my family, not a life built by a man who doesn't even know who he is." "I built it for you," I roared, the metal bar clattering as I surged forward. Thomas slammed me back into the chair, his hand crushing my windpipe for a second. "Easy, hero. You're proving our point." "Marcus," Sarah continued, her voice gaining a cold, sharp edge, "I've already sent the emails to your board of directors. I told them about your breakdown. I told them you've been diverting company funds. By tomorrow morning you won't have a license, let alone a firm. Just sign the papers. Take the little bit of dignity we're offering you and go back to whatever hole you crawled out of." I looked at her, really looked at her, and the image of the woman I loved began to dissolve, replaced by a stranger who had been calculating the cost of my soul for a decade. "And the house? You're really going to let your mother sell it to a developer? After everything I put into those walls?" Evelyn let out a sharp, jagged laugh. "It's already done, Marcus. The contract is signed. It's being gutted next week. It was never a home. It was an asset, and you were just the contractor who provided the labor." Then came the moment that broke me more than the arrest. I looked at Sarah, searching for a sign of protest, a flinch, anything. "Sarah," I whispered, "is that true? You're letting her destroy our home?" Sarah didn't answer. She simply turned her back on me and walked toward the door. That silence, that absolute crushing refusal to even acknowledge the destruction of our shared history, was the second twist that gutted me. She wasn't just a participant, she was the architect of the demolition. "She's not talking to you anymore, Marcus," Thomas said, pulling a pen from his pocket. "Sign, now." But they had made one mistake. They thought I was a man of stone and wood, someone who could be dismantled like a building. They didn't realize that an architect knows exactly where the load-bearing walls are. Before I could respond, the door to the interrogation room swung open again. This time, it wasn't a cop. It was David, my best friend and the most aggressive corporate litigator in the city. He looked at the scene, the cuffs, the papers on the table, Thomas's smug face, and a predatory smile spread across his face. "Step away from my client, officer," David said, his voice like a gavel. "And Sarah, Evelyn, I suggest you stop talking immediately, because I've been recording this entire conversation from the hallway through the open door, and I think the Internal Affairs Bureau is going to find the phrase, 'I'll lose the body cam footage,' very, very interesting." Thomas turned pale, his hand dropping from the papers. "You can't be in here. This is a secure area." "It's an interrogation room where you are currently committing extortion, Thomas," David replied, tossing a folder of his own onto the table. "And Marcus, you're not signing anything. Because while Sarah was busy planning your birthday, I was busy looking into that offshore holding company she mentioned. It turns out Evelyn wasn't losing money. She was laundering it. And Sarah? She wasn't just a consultant. She was the one signing the wire transfers." The third twist hit the room like a physical shock. Sarah spun around, her mask finally cracking. "What?" "Oh, did Mom not tell you?" David smirked, looking at Evelyn, whose face had turned a sickly shade of grey. "Evelyn didn't bring you into this to save the family, Sarah. She brought you in to be the fall girl. If the IRS ever came knocking, your name is on every single illegal document, not hers. You're not the partner in this.
You're the insurance policy." I sat back, the bile in my throat turning into a cold, hard knot of clarity. I watched as the three of them, the wife, the mother, the brother, started to look at each other not with love, but with the desperate, panicked eyes of cornered animals. The perfect family was beginning to eat itself alive. "David," I said, my voice steady for the first time since I hit the pavement. "Get me out of these cuffs. We have a lot of work to do." I looked at Sarah, who was now staring at her mother in horror. "You didn't just lose a husband today, Sarah," I said, my voice dripping with a quiet, lethal calm. "You lost the only person who was actually willing to protect you from her." The confrontation wasn't over, not by a long shot, but as David began citing the procedural violations that would force my immediate release, I felt the first spark of something new. It wasn't the warmth of the home I had lost. It was the icy, exhilarating heat of a man who has nothing left to lose and everything to burn down. The moment the heavy precinct doors hissed shut behind me, the rain hitting my face felt different. It wasn't a cold intrusion anymore. It was a baptism. I stood on the sidewalk, my wrists chafed red from the cuffs, and watched Sarah and Evelyn drive away in their sleek black SUV. They thought they had won. They thought they had left a broken man behind them, a man whose life they had successfully dismantled. But as I watched their taillights fade into the grey mist, I felt a strange, terrifying shift inside me. The man who would have done anything to save his marriage had stayed in that interrogation room. The man standing on the pavement was someone new, someone who understood that when a structure is rotten to the core, you don't try to patch the cracks. You perform a controlled demolition. "Marcus?" David's voice was cautious as he stood beside me, his briefcase a heavy weight of legal ammunition. "We need to get to a hotel. We need to start the filings." "No," I said, my voice sounding foreign to my own ears, low, steady, and devoid of the tremor that had defined my life for the last few hours. "We're going to my office. I kept a backup of the household server there. Sarah didn't know about it. She thought the smart home system only controlled the lights. She didn't realize it logs every MAC address that enters the house, every door code used, and every conversation picked up by the security monitors in the foyer."
The transformation was absolute. I was no longer the grieving husband. I was an architect looking at a faulty blueprint. We spent the next 48 hours in a haze of caffeine and blue light. While Sarah was likely popping champagne in my living room, David and I were tracing the digital breadcrumbs of her betrayal. We found it all. The emails between Evelyn and the developer, a man named Sterling Vance, ironically no relation, but a long-time associate of Evelyn's. We found the wire transfers Sarah had signed, thinking she was helping her mother, unaware that the money was being routed through a shell company tied to an investigation the feds had been quietly building for months. But the final nail was the woman in the tan trench coat. Through the high-resolution footage from my neighbor's doorbell camera, which I had installed for them a year ago, we saw the whole rehearsal. 10 minutes before I walked down that street, Sarah, Evelyn, and the fainting woman stood on that very corner. The footage showed Evelyn handing the woman a small vial of something, and Sarah pointing towards my office building. They hadn't just gotten lucky. They had staged a play, and I was the only one who didn't have a script. The retribution didn't happen in a dark alley. It happened in the bright, sterile light of a boardroom 2 days later. Sarah and Evelyn were there, sitting across from the developer and his lawyers, ready to finalize the sale of my brownstone. They looked triumphant. Sarah was wearing a new suit, her eyes bright with the prospect of a fresh start built on my ruins. The door opened, and I walked in. I wasn't alone. Behind me was David, 2 officers from the state police, not Thomas's precinct, and a representative from the district attorney's office. Sarah's face went white. She stood up so quickly her chair tumbled backward. "Marcus, you aren't supposed to be here. You have a restraining order." "Actually, Sarah," David said, stepping forward and laying a thick stack of papers on the table. "That restraining order was vacated an hour ago when we presented the court with the footage of your victim practicing her fall with your mother. It's funny how witnesses talk when they're offered a plea deal for filing a false police report." Evelyn tried to rally, her voice a sharp, desperate rasp. "This is an outrage. This is a private meeting. Get out before I have my son arrest you." "Thomas is currently being processed for civil rights violations and evidence tampering, Evelyn," I said. My voice was like ice, cutting through her hysteria. I walked to the head of the table and looked at the developer. "Mr. Vance, I'd be very careful about signing anything today. Unless, of course, you want to be named as a co-conspirator in a money laundering scheme involving the misappropriation of marital assets." The developer looked at the papers David had provided, then at Evelyn, and then he stood up and walked out without saying a word. Sarah looked at me, her eyes filling with tears, the same tears that used to make me melt. "Marcus, please, I didn't know about the money. Mom said, she said you were going to leave me. She said you were hiding money from me. I was just trying to protect my future." "The difference between us, Sarah," I said, leaning over the table, "is that I built a home for you. You built a cage for me. You didn't just break our marriage, you broke the law. And unlike our house, you can't renovate a prison cell." The fallout was swift and merciless. Thomas was stripped of his badge and faced a felony conviction. Evelyn's estate was frozen as part of the federal investigation into the shell companies. The matriarch, who prized her reputation above all else, ended up a headline in the local paper for all the wrong reasons. Sarah, caught between her mother's greed and my evidence, was left with nothing. The boutique firm I had funded was liquidated to pay for her legal fees. In the end, she didn't even have the brownstone she had betrayed me for. 6 months later, I sat on the back porch of that very house. The air was crisp, smelling of autumn leaves and the wood smoke from a neighbor's fireplace. The house was quiet, but it wasn't empty. It was full of the peace that comes from knowing every brick was mine, Every beam was honest. I had finished the renovations myself, stripping away the last of the modern touches Sarah had insisted on, revealing the original, stubborn beauty of the mahogany underneath. I took a sip of my coffee, the heat a comfort against the morning chill. I had lost a wife, a brother-in-law, and a sense of security I thought was permanent. But in their place, I had found a strength that couldn't be designed or drafted. I had learned that the most important structure any man can build is the one inside himself. I looked at the garden, where the chives I had planted were still growing, green and resilient against the coming winter. Life is a series of foundations. Some are built on sand and lies, destined to collapse at the first sign of rain. Others are built on the hard, cold truth of who you are when everything is taken away. I leaned back in my chair and closed my eyes, a small, genuine smile touching my lips. A house is just wood and stone. A home is where you no longer have to look over your shoulder.